the Generalized System of Preferences, what's known as GSP, and the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is known as AGOA. These programs are an important but forgotten piece of the U.S. trade agenda puzzle. They're win-win, promoting economic growth in developing countries while supporting manufacturing and small business jobs here at home. They also play an important role in countering Chinese economic dominance by strengthening our trade relationships, promoting American values abroad, and creating incentives to shift supply chains out of China and into more stable suppliers. I think we can all agree that sounds like a recipe for success. Now we have to deal with the fact that the general system of preferences expired in 2020, and most programs are set to expire next year. Since GSP lapsed, companies are either paying more in tariffs and investing less in their own businesses, or are faced with a tough choice about shifting supply chains back into China. If our country is serious about moving away from Chinese manufactured goods and creating good-paying red, white, and blue jobs, renewing GSP is a good place to start, and I believe Democrats and Republicans on this committee share that view. The GSP is a good example of how smart policy can have a direct impact on workers, businesses, and manufacturers. It's allowed companies in my home state to import everything from optical equipment to wooden floors to sweeteners, add value to them in Oregon, and then sell them all over the world. It's also helped save Oregon families and businesses $3 million in just 1 year. But these programs aren't just about lowering costs. They include strong protections for our workers, intellectual property protection, and market access for American exporters. Developing countries are encouraged to raise their own standards, making GSP a powerful tool for change. For years, China has been building relationships with developing countries by investing in new infrastructure. Often they do it with unfair strings attached. Trade preference programs help offer an alternative to Chinese investment by strengthening our ties with developing countries and showing the benefits of strong trading partnerships with the United States. 3 years ago, the Senate passed my bipartisan bill with Ranking Member Crapo to renew and improve GSP by the very tight margin of 91-4. It stalled, however, in the House. I will continue working with Ranking Member Crapo to get this across the finish line as soon as possible. Next, I'd like to touch on AGOA. Africa has a growing population and a potentially vibrant economy. African countries need alternatives to China and Russia. AGOA knocks down tariffs on products coming from sub-Saharan African countries, and it supports economic development while advancing American values. This is important in key sectors like critical minerals, where Chinese investment is outpacing the United States and allowing labor violations and environmental degradation to run rampant. AGOA expires in 2025. This is an ideal opportunity for us to talk about how to strengthen the program. The committee will need to consider how to encourage the use of AGOA while supporting trade within Africa, as well as how to modernize the program to meet the needs of advancing digital trade and innovation. My view is it is long past time for AGOA countries to graduate to a more robust two-way trade relationship with the United States, and that outcome ought to be the centerpiece of renewable efforts. Last week, the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Richie Neal, and I called for the USTR to expand its negotiations with Kenya to reflect a more robust trade agenda. A renewed AGOA would provide a key step to deepening U.S. engagement in the region. So we look forward to introducing our panelists and hearing from them. They're experts on how to modernize, revitalize, and renew GSP, AGOA, and other key programs. I'm also especially interested this morning in the Hope and Help programs for Haiti. I think they're very valuable, and there's substantial member interest in those issues as well. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Crapo, members of our committee on both sides of the aisle. We've worked on these issues in a bipartisan way, and with the House to advance a package of trade programs that's going to get robust bipartisan support. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate deeply your holding this hearing on these critical programs. And I appreciated your noting that we've already made it clear in the Senate that the support for GSP is strong and bipartisan, and we've got a plan already put together. Preference programs are good when administered effectively. The programs can drive economic development for developing countries, including by creating new opportunities for women and reducing poverty. For the United States, they can help facilitate equitable market access and strategically help partners become more competitive vis-a-vis China. While preference programs are good, comprehensive trade agreements are better because they maximize economic opportunities and promote the highest standards. We need them now more than ever. Africa is a particularly telling case, as is shown by the chart that'll be put up behind me very quickly here. As the chart shows, we are losing economic ground in Africa to China, even with AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The Trump administration got it right when it stepped up our engagement in Africa through its negotiation efforts to get a real free trade agreement with Kenya. And I appreciate our chairman's comment about how critical that is to get done. The Biden administration, however, imprudently terminated that in an effort of low-ambition framework agreements that fail to reduce tariffs and lack commitments on key disciplines that are integral to comprehensive trade agreements. Although I support programs like the General System of Preferences program and AGOA, we need to resume negotiating real, comprehensive trade deals before it is too late. In the interim, though, while the administration takes no steps toward meaningful trade agreements, Congress can at least prevent us from falling back by us getting these preference programs back on track. Congress can renew GSP now and ensure early reauthorization of other preference programs such as AGOA. Since many AGOA users make purchasing decisions 2 years in advance, we should not leave them in uncertainty by waiting to decide on the program's future next year. The more than 3-year GSP lapse is painfully instructive and calls for immediate renewal. Because of this lapse, Americans paid an extra $3 billion in tariffs, and companies are moving production from developing countries to China. Reauthorization of GSP should not be controversial. Unlike other trade expansion programs where some industries might face increased competition, GSP is designed not to contain import-sensitive goods. This body proved GSP was bipartisan, as Senator Wyden has already mentioned, and non-controversial in the Senate when it voted 91-4 last Congress to reauthorize it. Our Republican colleagues on the House Ways and Means Committee are also ready to see GSP passed and have already approved a bill that adopted many elements of our Senate compromise, including on labor and environment. GSP's passage has been stalled by some attempts to achieve unrelated partisan items, with the most recent demand being reauthorization of Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA, a program that has never been tied to GSP or to any other preference program. As my colleagues know, TAA is traditionally a trade-off for actual trade promotion authority. If folks support preference programs, then they should let them move forward as soon as possible without any unnecessary linkages. Each day that GSP remains lapsed and the fate of other preference programs remain uncertain is a day China moves ahead. I am ready to see GSP, AGOA, and potentially other preference programs all passed as a part of a package by the time of the AGOA Forum next month. That step would demonstrate to our partners, particularly in Africa, that the United States, not China, represents the opportunity for a brighter economic future. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Let me introduce our guests. Ms. Flora E. Lizer as president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. She's an expert on the subject of U.S.-Africa trade, previously served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative overseeing implementation of AGOA. Then we'll next have Ms. Nelson. She's the General Counsel and Corporate Secretary for the Sanmar Corporation, a family-owned firm that's the largest U.S.-based wholesaler of custom and printable apparel. She's here from the Pacific Northwest. We always have a special affection for that. Then we have Mr. Lincecum. He's the Vice President of General Economics at Cato, where he focuses on international and domestic economic issues, including trade and supply chains, and Ms. Allison Gill, the Legal Director for Global Labor Justice. She has over 2 decades of experience working as an advocate for human and worker rights around the globe. So we thank all of you for coming. You are, in fact, the all-stars of the professional field. And we're anxious to hear from you. Let's start with you, Ms. Lizer. Liz Uzier.
Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and other members of the Senate Finance Committee for inviting me here on behalf of Corporate Council on Africa, our board, and our many members who are investing into Africa and trading with African nations. In a world full of pressing challenges that tend to dominate the headlines, it can be easy to overlook the significant changes that are happening in Africa. You will all be familiar with the long-term population dynamics that will see the continent's population double over the next 2 decades, making Africa both the largest source of workers as well as an increasingly important market for companies across the globe. African leaders understand that this dynamic is a potentially huge asset that can drive their economic development if they can put the right policies in place to create the jobs that all those young people will need. African leaders are already actively pursuing private sector investment and global partnerships to jumpstart this process. Many of them are looking to the United States as an important partner, as we saw with the state visit of Kenyan President Ruto to Washington 2 weeks ago, and the robust representation of 16 African delegations, including 6 heads of state at CCA's own U.S.-Africa Business Summit in Dallas a month ago. Since 2000, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, has been the primary tool for American economic engagement with Africa. As such, AGOA has taken on a strategic element that makes it much more than just a trade program for African countries. As AGOA's current authorization nears its expiration in 2025, I would encourage the committee to take account of AGOA's importance in the overall U.S.-Africa strategic relationship and would offer 4 main points for your consideration today. The first is about the broader context in which today's discussion of AGOA renewal takes place. Africa in 2024 is very different than the Africa of 2000 when AGOA was first put into effect. Through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, AFCFTA, African countries are creating a much more harmonized and unified market across the entire continent by reducing and removing both tariffs and non-tariff barriers. This is making it more commercially feasible for African companies and others sourcing from Africa, like the United States, to create the networks and regional value chains that will make African suppliers more competitive and diversify out of China, while also expanding intra-African trade as well as the continent's trade with global partners like the United States. The evolution of AFCFTA and creation of regional value chains will also address one of the concerns about relatively low utilization rates under AGOA. As these value chains develop, African companies are more likely to be able to meet the scale and sophistication that the U.S. market tends to require. The second related point I would offer is that the United States should adapt how it frames trade and investment issues with Africa to match this evolution in the African market. Understandably, we have tended to focus over the last 24 years on a country-by-country analysis of AGOA utilization to assess or rate AGOA's success and how well the United States is doing in terms of its broader trade and investment strategy. We should and can think much bigger than this. We should be looking at priority sectors like agribusiness, automotive, transportation, and pharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals, as well as energy and ICT. These are all sectors that play to the strengths of American companies. The United States should adapt how we measure success to focus more on engagement in these priority sectors and to work with regional economic communities. The third point is that the United States should also expand its range of strategic tools to achieve a broader set of strategic objectives for U.S.-Africa economic engagement. AGOA was never intended to be all and end all of U.S. trade and investment policy towards Africa, but has become the single basket and tool into which advocates of stronger ties with Africa look to include everything that we're doing. Fourth and lastly, I'd like to end with a practical pitch to renew AGOA as soon as possible this year. Key industries like textiles and apparel operate on 18 to 24-month lead times, which is beyond the current expiration of AGOA. AGOA trade is already declining. The uncertainty about AGOA's renewal is already causing orders to be canceled. And soon, factories will be closing, and many of those thousands and thousands of women I've personally seen in those factories and youth will be fired. I understand that the argument this AGOA renewal is a great opportunity to make some changes, and there are several non-controversial changes that can be made. Finding a way to include North African countries into AGOA accumulation, looking at the issue of modifying graduation criteria for countries like Mauritius that have done well and are moving into the middle income status. Other controversial changes would include eliminating the textile visa requirement for Africa to harmonize with customs procedures used for all the other apparel exporters to the United States, and increasing the apparel quotient. It would also be helpful to review AGOA every 3 years and not annually. Fewer reviews would make the program more reliable and incentivize investors. Let me end by saying that CCA notes the longstanding bipartisan and bicameral support for AGOA, welcomes the support for AGOA reflected in bills introduced by other committees, including the recent bill introduced by Senator Coons and Senator Risch. We commend this committee for holding this hearing and urge that you work with your House counterparts to craft an AGOA renewal bill that can hopefully be passed as soon as possible in 2024. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering any questions and offering CCA as a partner in following up from today's hearing.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate particularly you're talking about supply chain resiliency in your remarks, because if you want a secure and resilient supply chain, China is not it. So I appreciate your putting this into perspective. I want to ask all our witnesses, if you could, please try to stay within 5 minutes, because we've got a lot of senators that are interested. Ms. Nelson.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to discuss the urgency of quickly renewing AGOA. SanMar is a family business that relies heavily on sourcing from AGOA countries. Thousands of jobs, both in the U.S. and AGOA countries, rely on us having access to this program. You may not have heard of SanMar, but you've likely come across some of our products. We supply undecorated blank apparel caps and bags to over 65,000 companies who then customize our products for their customers. Most of our customers are small businesses who are the touchstones of their communities, sponsoring the soccer team and making sure everyone has a matching shirt when they race for the cure. These companies do light manufacturing in the U.S. They might have a handful of employees or employ hundreds. If you look inside the label of one of our shirts, there's a good chance it would say made in Ghana or made in Madagascar. But the vast majority of the value of that shirt is created in the United States. And it all depends on having access to AGOA. Last year, SanMar imported over 58 million pieces from AGOA countries. So let's say you are a counselor at Camp Crapo. You might need a shirt like this.
I'm sure it's incredibly well attended.
This shirt was designed in Washington State Sown in Ethiopia, cross-docked in Florida, and decorated by one of our 650 customer businesses in Idaho. Or say you work at Wyden Wilderness. You might need this shirt.
Scarlet Willow Wyden might go there.
This was designed in Washington State, sewn in Madagascar, cross-docked in Florida, and decorated by one of our 1,100 customer businesses in Oregon. I could do the same for each of these, okay? Kenya, Haiti, Ghana. I think this one is also Ghana. I like the patch on this one. They were all designed in Washington and decorated in one of your states. Where the garment was sewn is an important piece, but it only represents part of the value chain. So many U.S. jobs depend on being able to import duty-free under AGOA. Sanmar employs over 5,000 people across 9 states. Close to 1,300 of those are professional positions. These are highly skilled jobs that require decades of experience in areas of product design, engineering, IT, marketing, and logistics. Sanmar's apparel production in 5 AGOA countries provides good jobs for over 9,000 people there. 70 to 80% are women. These jobs provide stability and drive the socioeconomic growth of the region. When we first started manufacturing in Tanzania, the factory was basically the only building in the area. Now, the entire economy has changed to cater to workers who have disposable income. Hair salons, nail salons, restaurants, even a moped shop. The transformation has been remarkable. AGOA created the incentive to move production from China to Tanzania, but it was not easy. Setting up a new facility with a population that had largely been agrarian required significant training. We started with the least technical products, t-shirts, so the workforce could learn the basics before adding more sophisticated items like sweatshirts and polo shirts. It took years before we were able to achieve the quality and type of product we wanted to produce. The process has been longer and more difficult than we anticipated. That's why AGOA needs a long renewal period now. The product development cycle, when sourcing from even an established factory in these countries, is close to 18 months. With the program set to expire next September, we are already within that window and making business decisions with the expiration date in mind. Staring down the expiration date has put many potential investments on hold for the past few years. We are missing an incredible opportunity. There is so much potential in vertical integration, but companies are hesitant to invest when the benefits of AGOA could expire before a return on investment. Textile plants cost hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, and they can take years to build. Businesses need certainty before taking that next step. Vertical integration is possible, but we're not there yet. There is simply no fabric available in AGOA countries. That's why we need to maintain the current rules of origin. The region has phenomenal potential, but businesses need the stability of a long-term renewal to create a sustainable manufacturing base. Happy to answer questions on AGOA or GSP, which we strongly support. Thank you so much.
Great presentation. Thank you. Mr. Linekum.
I don't have any swag. Sorry. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Scott Lincecum, and I'm the Vice President of General Economics and Trade at the Cato Institute. I always welcome the chance to speak before Congress, but I must admit today is a bit bittersweet. U.S. preference programs have long been so uncontroversial up here that committee hearings weren't necessary. You mentioned the Senate vote, but in the House in 2018, GSP renewal passed by a lopsided margin of 400 to 2. That the program is now sat expired for 3 years, and trade watchers are now openly contemplating AGOA's expiration too, is an unfortunate statement, I believe, about the state of U.S. trade policy today. As I and my Cato colleagues have documented, preference programs like AGOA and GSP are imperfect. Product exclusions, import limits, eligibility criteria, and administrative requirements limit the program's usefulness. But the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good, and there are strong economic, geopolitical, and moral reasons to extend, if not expand, these programs today. Let's start briefly with the economic case. Preference programs have delivered important benefits for the people participating in them. AGOA saves American companies around $300 million per year in foregone tariffs. These are savings that they pass on to American consumers or use to expand their own business operations. Since GSP expired, it's been the opposite situation. Between 2021 and 2023, American companies have paid almost $3.4 billion in additional import taxes. A few $1 billion in tariff savings might mean little to a $27 trillion U.S. economy that imported $3.8 trillion in goods and services last year, but it can be critical to Americans participating in these programs, especially small businesses. Indeed, the typical GSP beneficiary in the United States only saves about $150,000 in tariff savings a year, but the typical company also only employs about 20 people. Tariff savings for the small American firms, like I've documented in my written testimony, in California, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Idaho, are a rounding error in the national statistics, but for these companies, can mean the difference between business life and business death. The programs are probably more important for developing countries. Exports surging under AGOA include apparel from Kenya and Lesotho, beef from Namibia, auto parts from South Africa. These and other qualifying goods are a tiny share of all U.S. imports, but big shares of the country's total sales to the United States, supporting tens of thousands of jobs in the process. Recent research thus finds that trade is, quote, one of the top interventions that governments can undertake to boost global development. It is, in the author's words, amazingly good for the poorer half of the world. This is also why U.S. trade with poorer countries has not facilitated the much ballyhooed race to the bottom for labor and environmental conditions, but in fact a race to the top. On labor, countries that are globally integrated have better living standards, better working conditions. Poverty and child labor have collapsed in our hyper-globalization era. Thus, the OECD recently concluded that, quote, the worst fears about the race to the bottom have not materialized, and a large empirical literature points to the opposite conclusion. The environmental story is more complicated, but eventually just is optimistic. Countries' early-stage development can worsen environmental conditions, but the trend reverses as wealth increases. Poorer nations are also greening more quickly than their richer peers did, with trade again helping to boost that process, particularly by disseminating new technologies. Anecdotes disproving the race to the bottom thesis, as I document in my testimony, also abound. Not all participants are good actors, of course, and more work needs to be done. But in general, keeping poor countries poor, including by blocking trade or attaching onerous conditions to program benefits, will simply impede the good progress they're making. The geopolitical case is even stronger, and it reflects two facts. First, beneficiary countries provide a strategic alternative to Chinese imports. As the Wall Street Journal has reported, tariff savings under GSP allowed companies to shift suppliers to non-China countries. When GSP expired, guess what? They snapped back to China. For this reason, the House China Select Committee has included GSP reauthorization among its 150 policy recommendations to reset the U.S.-China relationship. Second, preference programs are a cost-effective way to boost global stability and U.S. relations with developing countries, many of which have been pulled into China's geopolitical orbit. And here I would note that these governments are clamoring for more economic engagement, and foreign aid is simply not a substitute for that engagement. Between 2001 and 2019, imports from AGOA countries were about 5 times larger than the value of U.S. foreign aid over the same period, and tight federal budgets might shrink that aid even more. Finally, there's a strong moral case for continuing these programs. In the United States, our annual median income is about 7 to 12 times as much as the income of these people in these preference program countries. One of the best and easiest ways to help the world's poorest people live better is to help them get rich, and these programs play a small role in that process. In closing, let me just say, preference programs alone are an insufficient level of economic engagement with the developing world. Nevertheless, they provide undeniable economic and geopolitical benefits for the United States and our allies, while helping to fight global poverty and to make the world a better, greener place. Continuing them is the least we can do. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gill, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to testify before you today on the urgent need for the reauthorization of the generalized system of preferences with its labor rights conditionality. My name is Allison Gill. I'm the legal director of Global Labor Justice, a non-governmental organization that works to hold corporations and investors accountable for labor rights violations in their supply chains, to advocate for policies and laws that prevent forced labor and protect decent work and just migration, and to strengthen freedom of association, new forms of bargaining, and workers' organizations. I am here to advocate for a renewal of GSP and to urge you to use this opportunity to update GSP to ensure that it is fit for purpose for the increasingly globalized economy, including a gender lens. At Global Labor Justice, our experience with GSP runs deep. The International Labor Rights Forum, one of the organizations that eventually merged to become Global Labor Justice, was founded almost 40 years ago by a coalition of labor leaders and activists who came together in 1984 to help secure the inclusion of labor rights conditionality in the GSP, the first ever labor rights clause in a preferential trade program. In the decades since, we have been a leader in the use of GSP's labor rights provision to challenge labor rights abuses committed by both governments and corporations, and to push the U.S. to use its economic leverage to ensure that countries benefiting from GSP fulfill their labor rights obligations to workers. I would like to underscore that while there is a need to update the labor provisions of GSP, which I will touch on in a moment, the most pressing need fundamentally is to reauthorize the program. For the more than 3 years since GSP expired, workers and their advocates have not been able to leverage the program to incentivize labor rights compliance or impose accountability for violations. I will briefly raise the case of the Philippines as an example of the impact of this lapse. In 2021, Global Labor Justice, with the AFL-CIO and 20 other U.S. and Philippines-based trade unions, filed a petition under the GSP documenting systemic and violent repression of union leaders in the Philippines, among other violations. The Philippines is one of the largest beneficiaries under the GSP. In 2020, GSP exports from the Philippines accounted for nearly a fifth of the country's total exports to the United States. As its top trading partner, the U.S. has unprecedented leverage to use its trade relationship to incentivize movement toward better labor conditions. And the GSP, with its power to act as both carrot and stick, is a powerful tool for this purpose. Until the GSP is reauthorized, however, the USTR is unable to act on the information in our petition. It is workers who suffer the consequences. Since 2016, more than 60 union leaders across sectors in the Philippines have been red tagged as terrorists and assassinated, including 4 in the first quarter of 2021, following the expiration of GSP and just before we filed our petition. Despite the prevalence and violence of reprisals, workers in the Philippines continue to organize. They continue to demand a level playing field with workers across the global market, including respect for fundamental labor rights. This is the type of development and growth the GSP can encourage, a real race to the top, and it should do so as soon as possible. In reauthorizing GSP, Congress has the opportunity to build upon and improve GSP's strong labor rights conditionality to ensure that GSP meets its development goals of diversifying economically developing countries and growing trade without harming American workers. This includes updating GSP's labor rights framework to align with the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, adding standards on women's empowerment, human rights, and the rule of law, and imposing a minimal level of compliance to require that beneficiary countries effectively afford worker rights and are not merely taking steps to do so. Finally, we believe that labor justice begins at home. While we urge Congress to reauthorize GSP, we urge you to do it with a renewal of trade adjustment assistance. Strong labor standards and protections for workers on both sides of the trade relationship are good for all workers. We join our sisters and brothers in the U.S. labor movement who have called for GSP renewal to be paired with trade adjustment assistance for U.S. workers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll start with you, Ms. Gill. So these trade programs are based on a pretty straightforward proposition. Our trading partners can get tariff breaks on goods that they ship to the United States. That helps their economy. And in return, they've got to commit to high standards. things like labor and IP protection, and a number of my colleagues on this committee have done very good work on that. The key, obviously, is enforcement. And if a country fails to meet its commitments, it ought to lose the breaks it gets. So it's critical that we monitor compliance and take enforcement action when needed. Why don't you, if you would, walk the committee through the whole question of how you work with, say, the GSP petitions to improve labor standards and eliminate practices like forced labor, for example. Tell us how you work through this process.
Sure, and thanks for the question. Our organization has filed numerous GSP petitions under the labor provision over the years, often together with union partners in the sectors where we work. And these petitions and the country practice review process that follows is an important part of scrutiny of a country's labor practices, and is often an important tool to incentivize improvement because no country wants to lose its trading benefits. And I think GSP allows some targeting of particular commodities or sectors, so it is a bit more nuanced, less of a blunt instrument than some other trade enforcement tools. So we like it also for that reason. And I will just flag two examples of petitions that we worked on that had an impact. One is Uzbekistan. Back in 2007, we filed a petition on Uzbekistan because of systematic, state-imposed, widespread, forced adult labor and child labor in the country's cotton harvest. And the regular country practice reviews that followed were an important tool to shed light on what was at the time a very closed country with very limited means of scrutiny. And it became a really important way to challenge directly the government's narrative that it wasn't using forced labor. And ultimately, that led to the elimination of state-imposed forced labor in 2021. And for many, many years, the country practice reviews were part of an important dialogue that led to a broader campaign of pressure on that country. The other that I would flag, as I mentioned in my testimony, is the Philippines, where we have filed petitions in the past. And as you know, the labor rights conditions for labor leaders, for members, for organizers, and for activists are very, very serious in the Philippines. And the union partners came to us in 2021 looking for leverage to push their own government to stop these attacks and the violent repression against unions. And as a major beneficiary of the GSP, they had identified that the US had significant leverage to pressure their government. And we had hoped that the threat of loss of benefits could prompt improvements, but that was just before the program lapsed and we weren't able to proceed.
I very much like the way you described the kind of tools that you have with something like this, because we often compare on trade policy to a toolbox because we'd like to put an array of tools in there. And my colleagues, Senator Brown and Senator Casey, particularly have focused in on this whole notion of a targeted kind of toolbox. And I think it makes a lot of sense, and we appreciate your good work. Just a question for you, Ms. Nelson, because I really have questions for all of you. You've been a real success story in terms of using these programs, and you use the programs to support your own business and small businesses across the country. Tell us a little bit about how you add value to other American businesses. I gather there's printing, there's embroidery, there's embellishment, there's a variety of companies where there's a pretty good economic multiplier. Why don't you describe that?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. When you talk about, the T-shirt that says Wyden Wilderness, well, it's not just the people who designed the shirts in Washington State. You have an IT team to support it that's 250 people just at Samar alone. But then it leaves our door, right? And so across Stockton, Florida, you're talking about the folks at the port who are unloading it. You've got the domestic trucking agencies who are bringing it. And because our product gets embellished, you have the screen printers, the embroiderers, you've got tons of different styles of embellishing a garment. That's its own industry, by the way, that we're supporting because there's new technology all the time. Are you going to sublimate the shirt? Then it gets sent out to their end users. Again, you're talking about more shipping, trucking agencies, but The backbone behind it that supports all of that, the marketing, a PR for a company, the sales team, there are so many people involved. The industry that we support is 500,000 employees.
I don't know if you'd ever sell one of those Wyden T-shirts, but I'm barely a household word in my own household. But I get the concept, and we very much like the economic multiplier that you've described. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. I think you would sell tons of those in Oregon.
There we are. There we are. Crapo speaks truth.
First of all, let me go to you, Mr. Lincecum. Interestingly to me, some argue that increasing global economic engagement makes us more vulnerable and dependent on China. According to these critics, they argue that we should avoid any type of market opening, including through preference programs. You've done a great deal of research on the implications of trade expansion on U.S. competitiveness and our geopolitical position. Can you explain why you believe that trade expansion, including through preference programs, improves our economic and our strategic position vis-a-vis China?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. There's a host of reasons, and I'll try to keep it brief, but I think Ms. Nelson actually hit on one that's very important. About half of everything imported in the United States are manufacturing inputs. These are things that American manufacturers use to make globally competitive products. So when you reduce barriers to those imports, you actually are boosting a lot of manufacturers, particularly in advanced products like aerospace and transportation, where there are potentially national security or defense-related implications. So first, it's a good thing for those manufacturers. But also, of course, there are export benefits as well. Manufacturers not only in the United States can make more money selling abroad, the usual line about 95% of all consumers are outside of the United States, but it also means better relations with a lot of those countries, non-China countries in particular. About 90% of all trade that the United States engages in every year is with countries that aren't China. We should be looking to expand those relationships given the potentially geopolitical implications. And as I mentioned in my comments in my written testimony, look, programs like GSP and AGOA are a small part of that, but there needs to be more done. You mentioned free trade agreements, engagement at the World Trade Organization, broader unilateral liberalization for manufacturing inputs and the rest. These are all parts of that special sauce that can make the United States more globally competitive through economic engagement abroad.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Leiser, I'd like to direct my next question to you. You visited a number of factories and businesses in Africa that benefit from AGOA. Some critics argue that non-oil exports from AGOA countries are fairly small, and thus AGOA is not particularly relevant. However, the critics may not appreciate that even small export volumes stimulated through AGOA can lift a much larger number of people out of poverty, including women in particular. You've already referenced that in your testimony, but would you please share a little more fully your experience to help this committee understand how small exports benefit African development?
Thank you very much for that question. It is one of the things that we are always trying to clarify. People say that AGOA is only benefiting a handful of countries in a handful of sectors, but it really is not true. In 2023, of the 37 AGOA-eligible countries, 21 of them exported more than $1 million worth of exports under AGOA to the United States. Now, from the context of the huge economy that the United States is, a company in Ghana or Tanzania or Kenya that might export a container a month of their product, whatever it may be. I've been to factories producing fruit juices or canning vegetables or cut flower farms where they're exporting here as well, not just textiles and apparel. I went to one where they're producing sunglasses and toys and so forth. But even if they only export one container a month to the U.S. and the amount is very small, really nominal from our perspective, when you see the hundreds of people in the factory who are making that product. And then you have to think about the multiplier effect of people who are supported throughout the economy. When you come out of those factories, you'll see people with little stands where they're selling food. Or in Lesotho, there was a place where it's cold, so they sold those blankets that they wrap themselves in. So for every worker in those factories, they get an income that is reliable. It pulls especially women out of the informal market where they now have resources. And I can't tell you all how many people have said to me, I now have school fees to send my girls to school as well, or I was able to put a new roof on my home. So it is small on our end, admittedly, but it has a huge impact on the other end, and we really need to change the narrative about what AGOA is doing there. I'd like to mention one other point. In the AGOA numbers, the products that African companies producing inputs for other AGOA-eligible countries don't get counted as their AGOA exports. And I'll just give you one quick example. In Lesotho, I visited a factory that's producing leather car seats that get sent to South Africa to put into automobiles there that then get shipped to the U.S. under AGOA. Lesotho's production of those car seats doesn't get included in their AGOA numbers. People don't realize that those 800 people in that factory are benefiting from AGOA. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. My time is up. I do have questions for you, Ms. Nelson and Ms. Gill, but I will submit them in the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lincecum, I just want to underscore the point that you raised in regards to the impact that the GSP and AGOA have on foreign policy. In my role in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I am frequently asked about both of those programs with representatives from other countries. They're critically important to help develop the economic prosperities of countries that we are seeking to have a more stable relationship with. And economic progress in those countries are critically important for stability. So I support both, and I just really wanted to underscore the point that you made there. But as Ms. Gill, you raised, we also elevate the human rights and rule of law standards in international trade by what we put into our bills. And with GSP, I was proud when we acted on it in this committee in 2021, we enhanced those standards. Unfortunately, we didn't get it to the finish line, and it expired, and it's causing a major problem. Yes, it affects large companies here, but it also affects smaller companies here. And one of the challenges we have, it affects the supply chains, and therefore we're finding companies maybe not even being able to continue their production and taking their production to the source material countries, which costs us jobs here. So for all those reasons, it makes little sense that we have not reauthorized the GSP program. And I just want to get a little bit further on the human rights and trade issues from Ms. Gill, if you will. And I have a question for Ms. Lisler as it relates to AGOA. Yes.
Thanks, Senator. Because there is this opportunity to revisit GSP with reauthorization hopefully on the horizon, it's an opportunity to ask more of our trading partners as well. And we do support some of the changes that were proposed in the Senate version. For example, the past eligibility requirement was for countries to take steps to afford internationally workers' rights. This should really be updated to ensure that those countries are effectively implementing those rights in practice so that really de minimis kinds of things can't be seen as credible evidence of improvement. You know, and we should add to the standards so that they align with core labor rights and international law. This concept that is in the current or the past GSP of internationally recognized worker rights isn't tied to a clearly recognized international legal standard. And we should add criteria specifically on women's empowerment to acknowledge that women's ability to exercise their fundamental rights as workers depends on their ability to exercise their human rights. These things are interlinked, and that is quite clear. And rule of law criteria are particularly important given the rising tide of authoritarianism around the world. Workplace democracy is fundamental to democracy. And so when we talk about exporting U.S. values, that's one of them. And authoritarian governments often seek to silence trade unionists, to seek to silence independent union activity and worker activity because of this clampdown on democratic space. And they shouldn't get away with that just because those are not worker rights.
Thank you. Ms. Lizar, I want to, we're talking, we have to act on AGOA this year, otherwise it expires. There is some conversation as to the eligibility of countries for AGOA, whether that should be revisited, whether additional standards should be added. I welcome your views as to whether we need to look at the current circumstances on governance and on the economic welfares of these countries as to whether we should be looking at changes in the qualifications.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. It's an excellent question, but I do think that the eligibility criteria currently of AGOA covers a wide range of issues: poverty reduction, good governance, rule of law. And I think that in essence, we are covering the range of principles that the United States has and that we believe are important in engaging with any of our international partners, including the Africans. And those Africans, over the years, I was able to see this, who do not meet the eligibility criteria, basically, they are put out of AGOA, made ineligible, and then when they get back on the right track, they become eligible again. We've seen this various times with countries, Madagascar has been in and out. Cote d'Ivoire has been in and out of AGOA. And so I believe that the eligibility criteria are actually working and that we need to just simply keep applying them effectively by the interagency that decides every year now, but we're recommending that it be done every 3 years. It doesn't take anything away from our power to act if a country does something like a coup, right, in the interim, but it gives more certainty and reliability for the investors and the traders, our buyers, if we can do it every 3 years. But again, we have the right and the ability, even in an interim period, to go back and say, okay, this country is not meeting our criteria, and therefore they're ineligible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would just say to our guests and those that are following this, you just saw why we are going to miss Senator Cardin so much, because he outlined an area that there was great bipartisan interest in this committee on, and that was strengthening the standards associated with it. And I'm going to put into the record, but I see coming from Democratic members and Republican members matters like expanding the rule of law, women's empowerment, the environment, digital. I mean, these were all bipartisan efforts in this committee as related to the point that Senator Cardin was just talking about, which was our role in strengthening standards. So he will be much missed, and I already told him he's not going to get very far. We have this new thing called smartphones, so we can call him up when we have questions. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to join in this pro-trade love fest that we're having here today. This is a refreshing development, and I appreciate all the witnesses being here. So just a few questions. I'm particularly interested in AGOA and what's happening in Africa. Senator Crapo talked a little bit about the geopolitical impacts in Africa. And Ms. Lizar, I note that with the coups that are occurring in Africa, that the void is being filled, it seems like, by Russia and China across the board. Hardly democracies, hardly people sharing our values. And can you just talk to me a little bit more about the need, in terms of the geopolitics of Africa, filling the void that China and Russia would otherwise fill if we don't, by reauthorizing things like AGOA?
Thank you, Senator. I think that the U.S. has a great opportunity to enhance its relationship with the Africans and our economic partnership with them, recognizing that there are other actors in the world, Russia, China, that are very active on the continent, but they're not the only ones. Even our European partners and competitors are in Africa. The Brazilians are there, the Indians are there, et cetera. So the U.S. really does need to step up its engagement, and there are a number of ways we can do that through tools we have, Prosper Africa, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, DFC, et cetera, providing support to U.S. companies to actually sell their products to Africans who then use it to manufacture and send here. I recognize, though, also that there is a concern about some of the backtracking on democracy and rule of law that we've seen, particularly in West Africa, but we hope that it doesn't impact the narrative that Africa as a whole, 54 countries, it's not one country, 54 countries, there are many opportunities for the U.S. to engage there. And for those countries in West Africa, as I said, there have been some coups, some backtracking, Gabon, Niger, Burkina Faso, unfortunately. But I think to keep the pressure on them, basically to come back into the good practices of rule of law, political pluralism. These are things that are really important and sets an environment in those countries for trade and investment. That's what we tell them. You're doing this for other reasons, but you have to realize that this has an impact on the environment in your country, and our companies are not going to want to invest here. Those who are there may consider leaving or do leave, so you do need to get back on track. And some of them have, and as I said, over the years, you'll see that some of them fall out of the fold and then come back into the fold.
Well, we certainly can't promote our values if we're not there, which is what happens now, and that, as I pointed out, the void seems to be filled by those with other motives and very different values than we have. Senator Carper and I have joined together on a number of op-eds and a number of hearings about the opportunity we missed to take up the Trans-Pacific Partnership in particular. It was, in my view, a major mistake, and I blame Republicans and Democrats alike, but the fact of the matter is China is more than happy to fill that void, and we know what a negative influence they're having in terms of threatening their neighbors. Ms. Gill talked about the Philippines, comes to mind, but other countries in the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea that are being threatened, not the least of which is Taiwan now. And if we were more engaged in setting the standards with our friends and allies in the region, I think that would have a very positive influence. I remember a quote somewhere that I read that it goes basically along these lines. It says, make trade, not war. And there are economists and others, Mr. Lincomb, who argue that if you're trading with countries, you're less likely to engage in military conflict. Is there any truth to that?
Yes, definitely, Senator. Thank you. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago. I'm happy to provide it for the record, detailing the economics literature that shows repeatedly that countries that trade together tend to have less armed conflict between each other. Now, it's certainly not perfect. Russia and Ukraine have taught us that there are exceptions to that rule. But you're talking about a substantial decrease in the likelihood of cross-border armed conflict because of increased economic engagement. When you couple that with the fact that has already been mentioned, that countries like China and Russia are not simply sitting still, they're engaging in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. It's really critical that the United States get back into the game on trade policy, unlike what's been going on for the last few years.
Well, it may be too late with the current administration in terms of trade policy, but I think this is something that obviously there's strong bipartisan support for, and I think we need to pursue these arguments for the reasons that all of you have testified to. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank my colleague. I would just only add one point. Obviously, TPP was a debacle. One of the areas that I'm proud of for this committee is we came back pretty quickly with the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement.
Agreed.
We got to the key questions. Business wanted access to markets and to exports. We supported that. And a lot of working families said there's got to be a better job on the labor and enforcement issues. And so I think our bounce back capability, and Senator Cantwell continues to be a great champion, and I support her of these Pacific markets and happy to work with our colleagues.
I'm not giving up.
Well said. Okay. Our next senator will be Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding the hearing, and thank you all for being here. This is for Mr. Lincecum and Ms. Nelson. I just got back from Ecuador a few days ago. I met with President Daniel Noboa and his cabinet while we were there. He's been a staunch partner of the United States. Ecuador, as you know, is the only Latin American country on the Pacific coast that does not have a free trade agreement with the United States. And Ecuador wants the United States to stay as the country's top economic partner, but U.S. tariffs are too high for their products to be able to compete in this market. And as a result, Ecuador now exports the majority of its non-oil goods to China, with whom they recently finalized a trade agreement. Senator Cassidy and I, who I was just with a minute ago, recognize the need to address this gap in the U.S.-Ecuador partnership, which is why our Americas Act would temporarily extend market access to Ecuador and Uruguay through the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act, with the goal of eventually signing trade agreements with both these countries. Our goal is to build on the USMCA that the chairman talked about. Ms. Nelson, could you talk about your view, please, on including Ecuador and Uruguay in a trade preference program like the CBTPA might help, how that might help incentivize firms like Sanmar to purchase clothing from them? And then I'll come to you, Mr. Lincecum, after Ms. Nelson.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you for being here to answer that question.
Yes, I'll take it. And I'll note that there are over 1,000 customer businesses in Colorado that are relying on Sanmar's use of trade programs. Sanmar follows where the government tells us to go. When the government says, here's an incentive for providing duty-free access trade program for certain products in certain countries, we will go there. We do it responsibly, we do it sustainably, we don't simply turn a factory off and jump somewhere else. We are, engage in responsible purchasing practices, absolutely. But if you look at our history, in 2010, 46% of our imports came from China. Today, that number is 6%. Why? It's because of programs like AGOA, like GSP, like Haiti Hope. We are going where you incentivize us to go. So would we be happy to have additional options? Absolutely. I can't speak to the specifics of those two countries, and I don't know the infrastructure of what they actually, the sophistication level of producing apparel, caps, and bags. But absolutely, if you present an incentive for us to go, we will follow.
Thank you. Mr. Lincecum, could you talk a little bit about how extending trade preferences to additional Latin American countries could help the United States compete more effectively with Beijing?
Yeah, sure. And I think, GSP provides an unfortunate example in this regard. When GSP lapsed and tariffs snapped back, companies ended up moving out of those GSP beneficiary countries and moving back to China. And they did that because of the very large kind of inherent advantages that the Chinese sector has, the manufacturing sector, and then, of course, additional Chinese industrial policies as well. So when you increase market access, when you reduce trade barriers to GSP beneficiaries or to countries like Ecuador, you can make them more competitive vis-a-vis China or other large developed manufacturing nations. And I would add that, as has been mentioned repeatedly by my fellow panelists here, the certainty is a critical aspect here. And I think that's one reason why trade agreements are preferred over preferential packages and preference programs, because they provide that type of certainty for American investors like Ms. Nelson and others and buyers here to make sure that the money that they're spending in these developing countries is going to bear fruit, not just for a year or two, but for the long term. That helps them, and of course it helps those developing countries as well.
Just because you stole my second question, so let me respond. No, but by saying, the sort of the self-defeating position we're in with respect to GSP. I just happen to have the numbers here. Since GSP's expiration, outdoor retailers, including Colorado-based ones like the North Face, have paid a total of $1.53 billion in duties on products that were once GSP eligible. I mean, we're slitting our own throat, not to be too graphic about it, in a region, by the way, that is desperate for us to provide an alternative to Beijing. So, Mr. Chairman, I continue to look forward for this. I'm out of time. Could you please make a special provision in the record so that Christopher Coons, the senator from Delaware, knows I would have asked a question about AGOA if I had more time to deal with it.
Mr. Recorder, let us consider it done by unanimous consent. Senator Coons, like Senator Bennett, has spent a tremendous amount of time in these important trade precincts, and I appreciate him putting that on. Senator Grassley's next.
Yeah. I hope I have a reputation of being a free trader, and I think as time goes on, I'm in a minority in the Congress on that point, and maybe in a minority among the country as a whole. But I wish our country would learn some lessons from the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 that was supposed to help protect American agriculture and industry. And I think it had a great deal to do with the Great Depression that followed on very quickly. And I think we've learned since the Second World War that free trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty. I think I've read where free trade and capitalism together has probably reduced since in the last 60 years the world poverty rate is defined in different countries in different ways, but has reduced it from 50% down to about 10%. Now, trade tools like the General System of Preferences, or GSP, and AGOA are developing programs that also reduce costs for American consumers by lowering tariffs, just like free trade agreements do. That is why in 2020, when GSP was set to expire, I introduced legislation to extend it through April 2022. More recently, I'm glad to see the House pass the reauthorization of GSP out of their committee. I support this committee working together to finally pass GSP reauthorization and reauthorize AGOA before it expires. So my questions are to Mr. Lincicome. Do you think that reauthorizing GSP and AGOA can reverse the trend of China outcompeting the United States in investing in investments in Africa?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's a decent start. I'll put it that way. The fact is that, as we all know, these programs are somewhat limited by design. And they don't provide the type of certainty, the type of comprehensiveness that a broader trade agreement would provide. While, as we've discussed here today, the Chinese government is actively seeking more than just a bit of trade preference access in these same areas, whether it is the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or other trade agreements that the Chinese government is pursuing, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is investing in these places, or just simply bilateral investment. I mean, if you look at the numbers, the Chinese government, Chinese businesses are investing heavily in these places. So yes, of course, providing duty-free access via GSP, AGOA, other preference programs, doing it on a longer-term basis is good and fine, and as I've said, we should do it, but we definitely need a lot more than just that.
Could you speak to how GSP can move supply chains away from China?
Certainly, Senator. As I said previously, the fact is that China is a huge manufacturing nation. There's no doubt about that. And the fact they will have certain economies of scale that are very hard to defeat, even with U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. So preference programs give beneficiary countries and producers in those regions a leg up and make them far more competitive, particularly when you're talking about certain goods that are subject to very high tariffs in the United States otherwise. You know, when you're talking a few percentage points, well, that's maybe not a big deal, but 10, 20, 30% can be an insurmountable barrier for GSP and AGOA beneficiaries without that preferential market access when it comes to competing with a behemoth like China.
And my last question to you, are there other mechanisms Congress could include in GSP to encourage compliance on issues such as intellectual property rights outside the threat of removal or limitation on the participating country?
Thank you, Senator. I'll start with the general disclaimer that adding too many conditions or too onerous of conditions to these preference programs can eliminate their utility entirely. If companies can't qualify, if the conditions are too intense, well, then you're not going to get much trade, and then all of the benefits we've talked about today just simply won't materialize. That said, I think there should be more focus on company-specific actions and less on country-specific actions. Because when you punish a government for bad government behavior, well, then you end up with a lot of collateral damage. Tens of thousands of some of the poorest workers on the planet get punished for what their government did, perhaps even unbeknownst to them. So by focusing more on a company-specific level, you can target bad actors without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you. I thank my colleague. Senator Young is next.
Thank you, Chairman. I thank our witnesses for being here today. Before I dive into some specific lines of inquiry, I want to embrace Mr. Lincecum's message, which is we need more trade relations with more partners around the world, whether those are bilateral or multilateral or plurilateral agreements is less important to me at this point than the fact that we're striking more agreements, because other countries are as well. Much of my recent work in Congress has been as it relates to supply chain resiliency and what we're calling economic security, which of course has a direct impact on our national security. And it's lost, it seems, on certain members of this administration, as well as some in my own party, that we compete with adversaries. But the other side of it is we need to cooperate with friends and allies. Part of that cooperation is just coordination of critical inputs, but it's also by establishing free trade relations. It makes us more resilient when there are supply chain interruptions. Moving on, GSP renewal is something I'd like to dive into. It's critical for companies in my state of Indiana. They have paid over $60 million in extra tariffs since the program lapsed. The competitive need limits, or CNLs, which are built-in thresholds that trigger the removal of a product from GSP, need fixing. I was glad to see the House Ways and Means Committee pass some improvements. However, I'd like us to go further. From specialty woods used by the RV industry, travel goods, or industrial components used by Hoosier manufacturers, current CNLs eliminate duty-free treatment for products that have proven to be the most beneficial under GSP. It doesn't make sense. Renewing GSP should be a common sense objective with an opportunity to enhance the program's effectiveness and help incentivize supply chain shifts away from China. Ms. Nelson, would higher CNL thresholds help ensure that Sanmar can keep using GSP in the future?
Thank you so much for the question. And let me note that we have 1,400 customer businesses in Indiana who are relying on us to use GSP, to use these other trade programs. The main issue is speed of renewal. So in terms of changes to the program, from our perspective, the program was working until it stopped. And it did pull us from China. It did bring us to the Philippines and to Indonesia, to Myanmar. It is allowing us to export American values, and just renew it, please.
Okay, all right. I've internalized the urgency to get that done.
Thank you.
On behalf of those Hoosier businesses as well. Mr. Lincicome, if you could just very briefly discuss more broadly how artificial caps, like CNLs, competitive need limits, limit the usefulness of GSP both as a development tool and for the beneficiaries.
Of course. But first, Senator, let me say, using the term plurilateral, you're officially a trade geek. Welcome to the club. More seriously, a CNL limit effectively says to a company or a country, you've gotten too good at making stuff, so we're gonna cut you off. So that, like you said, it really makes no sense. We should be encouraging companies in these places to become more efficient, to not only for their own benefit, for the benefit of American manufacturers, American consumers here as well. So yes, I agree with you. I mean, personally, I would get rid of the CNL altogether, but we should at least be raising that threshold so that as companies mature, they continue to benefit from the program just as it's supposed to do.
Thank you so much. And before I close here, I want to recognize Senator Coons' leadership on AGOA and recognize relatedly that it takes an average of 16 years to bring a new mine online here at home. I think there may be another solution, sourcing raw minerals from abroad through foreign investment and market access. While an FTA should be the ultimate goal, renewing AGOA offers an immediate opportunity to strengthen our supply chains by partnering with African nations rich in these essential resources. Mr. Lincicome, very briefly, in your opinion, how can AGOA be updated to support the development of processing and refining infrastructure for critical minerals?
Thank you, Senator. I'll have to get back to you on the details of that. But again, I'll just say generally that, yes, this makes really great sense that you're leveraging the comparative advantages of these African nations in the very minerals that are supposedly critical to the future and the production of a lot of environmental goods. It makes perfect sense to be incorporating those into the agreement.
I'll look forward to that response, sir. And Ms. Leiser, if you would like to submit a response to that question, I would certainly welcome that as well. Thank you.
Yes, I would just say that we have these mineral supply partnerships that are important. We should be looking to put those in place with the DRC, Zambia, and other countries that have critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, et cetera. And then we might also want to look at the tax credits that IRA offers to FTA partners and potentially think about whether or not AGOA-eligible countries who have those critical minerals that we need, that we might not also incentivize investment into value addition in critical minerals in those countries instead of what's happening now where it gets shipped to China.
Yes.
And they make the EV batteries, et cetera.
As much as I value these important discussions, we've got to move on to Senator Warner. But Senator Young, look forward to working with you. Senator Warner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. And let me echo, hate to do this, but echoing my friend from Indiana's comments, one on complimenting Senator Coons, and I strongly fall in the camp that we need to renew AGOA. And you know, Mr. Chairman, as a member of the Senate Intel Committee, we spent a lot of time on critical minerals, and I want to get the same responses that Senator Young got. I think AGOA can be an enormous tool for us to work with African nations in terms of critical minerals. And my hope would be, as you just pointed out, you know, it's not just the extraction, but the real value add is in the processing. And mineral after mineral, China, wherever they extract, gets 80% of the processing. So if we could do that, whether here or particularly in Africa, allow Africa to have a bigger part of the value chain, I think it's extraordinarily important. I'm going to start my first question with you, ma'am, which is, and I apologize if other colleagues have already raised this. I think one of the greatest assets we have in this country is the African diaspora. And, you know, I look at my state, the African diaspora is the fastest growing part of Virginia's population. 1 out of 10 foreign-born citizens are first-generation African diaspora. We in Virginia are disproportionately Ethiopian. But one of the things that people, frankly, don't realize is that of all immigrant groups, the most educated coming into our nation are African diaspora. And Nigeria is the leader of the pack on all of that. So, Ms. Lazier, could you talk about how AGOA, other trade agreements, and what else we can do to take advantage of this resource? Because I frankly think with the African diaspora, you look at Africa's data numbers in terms of population growth, wealth growth, huge opportunities. We've not taken advantage of that African diaspora the way perhaps we have, like, I'm long India, I'm chair of the India caucus. The Indian American diaspora is terribly important in terms of our relations, but how can AGOA and other things help, and what else can we do in terms of the African diaspora?
So thank you for that excellent question and for recognition of a group that can play a key role in advancing and enhancing the trade relationship with Africa. Many of the businesses on the continent are SMEs, and even in many cases, micro SMEs, women-owned, youth-owned, but I think you also know that on this side, many of our businesses that are driving economic growth in the United States are also small businesses. And for diaspora-owned, minority-owned, women-owned businesses, a number of them we have found over the years connect with African SMEs in terms of trading. And we have examples of that, just one as an example, where a woman who is a Ghanaian American who was in the Peace Corps, she is in the shea butter field, and she imports products, shea products from Ghana in particular, which are value-added products, and then sells them in stores like Walmart and Target and so forth. The link there is that as a Ghanaian American, she has a link to that market. She has a passion for doing what she can do best, and she's also growing the American economy by the people that she employs on this side as well.
And it's one of the reasons why I think XM, DFC, and others. Right. But we also need to look at, again, those diaspora Africans who live in America, things like access to capital. Both of the other senators are working with me on CDFIs, community development financial institutions, different jurisdiction, but terribly important. I'm down to my last minute, and I got to get in some home cooking. Ms. Nelson, I was thrilled with Sanmar's announcement last year of $50 million in terms of a 1.1 million square foot distribution facility in Ashland, Virginia, which is Mr. Chairman, you may not know, but Ashland, Virginia's informal title is Center of the Universe. I'm not sure how they got that, but that's what they claim. But you picked a good location. I think you got 100 folks there already, getting up to 1,000. Now that I've made my commercial for Ashland, Virginia, and your facility there, in 20 seconds, tell me how AGOA is helping that kind of decision-making and investment on this side of the pond as well as.
Thank you so much. And in addition to the folks that we have and the giant facility we have there are also 1,100 customer businesses that rely on Sanmar having access to AGOA. We're a growth business. We're excited to be in Virginia, and the people there are phenomenal, by the way. But we are only able to grow our business because we have the ability to source this product duty-free from these 5 African countries. And they are the inputs for our customers. So, a t-shirt margin, the margin on a t-shirt is slim. They are the inputs that allow our customers to be able to customize and sell them on. The size of that distribution center, the number of employees that we will have is directly proportional to how well we are doing business, how well we are servicing our customers, and a giant portion of that is being able to source duty-free from these countries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think my colleague Ashland, Oregon will want to have a deal with Ashland.
We could have like an exchange from 2 centers of the universe.
Very promising concept. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you to the ranking member and our chairman as well for the collegiality on trade. To my colleague from Virginia, I think the Nevada African diaspora will give you a run for your money. We are very strong, bold.
We'll take that bet.
We'll take you on. Okay. I was just with many members, and it is true, Ms. Lazier. I will tell you, there's a woman from Ghana who has beautiful clothing that she's bringing into Nevada now and selling. It's fantastic to see, and it's fun to see women engaged in this, and this is going to be the focus of my questions for all of you. I support the reauthorization of not only the GSP, but AGOA. I had the opportunity in June to be in Africa with Chris Coons and some of my colleagues. We were in Zambia, we were in Angola, we were in Malawi, to name a few. And it was incredible to see the support for the AGOA, but it's everything you've said, why it's so important and why we need to continue to reauthorize it. But here's one thing I want to focus on, because this was my takeaway as well. The benefit to women and young girls, the liberation it gives to them to not only get educated, but then have a business or some focus for their future. Because I tell you, the challenges there, and as you all know, in some of those African countries, are doing right by young girls and women, and this is an opportunity to do so. And that was my takeaway. And that's why Senator Casey and I, we've been really focused on how we empower women through trade. So these are going to be my questions. The first one I have is, Senator Casey and I introduced the Women's Economic Empowerment and Trade Act, which would ensure that countries receiving trade preferences under GSP strengthen standards on the rights of women, for the very reasons that I just talked about. Ms. Gill, let me ask you, can the trade preference programs like GSP be more successful if there is explicit language not just on labor rights, but on women's rights and opportunity?
Thanks so much for the question. And the short answer is absolutely. We know very, very clearly from evidence that women workers can only exercise their fundamental labor rights when they can exercise their human rights. And that means to be free from violence, to be free from gender-based violence and harassment. And we also know that there's a clear interlink between gender-based violence and harassment and freedom of association. And when we have freedom of association in the workplace, when we have systems in place to combat gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace, in the world of work, you have safer, healthier workplaces, you have more empowered workers, and you get the kind of empowerment that you're talking about.
And that's right. And Ms. Lazier, as I was visiting these countries, we were looking at some of the manufacturing, and it was the women that were actually in these businesses that were working. I also was astonished to see the benefits of education and what it brings to these young girls and young women, and the opportunities now that they have for their future. So let me ask you, what do you think about applying some of these same ideas to the AGOA program to support women's economic opportunity and ensuring that we have some provisions in AGOA and the agreements as well for women?
So, Senator, I think that a focus on women in Africa, the important role that they have, more of the money that they get will go into their households, into the education of their children. No offense to men, but put $1 in a woman's hands and you'll see what happens with that versus $1 in a man's hand. There are other things, though, that can be done in addition to just talking about empowering them through trade, access to capital. Trade capacity building. I've been in factories where they're looking for buying a machine that might polish gems for jewelry they're making to ship to us that costs $5,000 and they can't get it. Right. So if we can, increase access to capital, trade capacity building, help them with business plans, these are things also that will help to empower women. They themselves know when they get those resources, they know what to do with them, but trying to make sure that they have access to those things that would make them more effective, more competitive traders, I think is important.
Yeah, I agree, and thank you for that. And let me just say, Ms. Nelson, Sanmar, thank you. Levi Strauss in Nevada. There's so many other businesses that partner with you, and thank you for the work you're doing. I only have a few seconds left, and is it Mr. Lee? Pronounce your last name for me. I've heard it different ways this morning.
Lincecum.
Okay, Lincecum. Let me ask you this. How does the lapse of GSP impact the tourism sector, which we haven't talked about, which obviously is important for my state in Nevada and Las Vegas? Is it making it more expensive for consumers to afford the goods needed to travel?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that's you answered your question.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, of course. To the extent that you are raising the price of travel goods and making it more expensive to buy a suitcase or whatever, then of course that's going to have downstream effects on the tourism sector as well. But also, I think it's again, we think broader about trade relationships, and as Americans are investing in whether it's GSP countries or AGOA countries, and we're increasing those kind of bilateral relations, and people will be more likely to visit the United States and go to Vegas and other places. And so that, it's certainly the travel goods and those products are important, but the broader economic relationship, I would say, is probably more so.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think my colleague, Senator Brown, has done as much as anyone who has said that working families have got to be the focus of trade policy, and he has dedicated years and years to that cause. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your comments about that and your leadership. Congress needs to pass a package that addresses trade issues, primarily renewing trade adjustment assistance. I want to be clear that this committee, this body, should not move forward any deal that doesn't make the Trade Protection Program its priority. TAA provides critical assistance to workers who have been harmed by foreign trade through no fault of their own. We see that every week in my state and throughout the Midwest. So-called free trade agreements crafted by corporate lobbyists and Washington insiders and presidents of both parties have sold out workers time and time again. We've seen how it plays out. Coastal elites always say, don't worry, we'll compensate the losers. How many times have I heard that? As if any amount of compensation could replace the dignity that a worker gets from a good middle-class job with skills you're proud of where you can support your family. TAA was supposed to be the solution, but it's the bare minimum. But Washington now can't even do that. TAA has been lapsed in full since 2021, but since then, countries like China haven't stopped cheating our trade laws. Corporations haven't stopped outsourcing, looking for the cheapest labor. Thousands of workers are left behind by the one lifeline that was supposed to work out for them. Right now, there are 115,000 workers with TAA petitions pending at the Department of Labor. That's 115,000, just not statistics, 115,000 stories of job loss, of financial stress, of uncertainty for families and communities because of the negative impacts of trade that far too many people in this town have advocated for. Our country owes these workers who Washington and corporate America cast aside. If we don't reauthorize TAA, it's a moral and economic failing for all of us. It's part of a larger failure of our government to stand up for the people who make this country work. It's happened when I was growing up in Mansfield and saw jobs first move to Alabama and Mississippi. Then when the geniuses in this town, aided and abetted by presidents of both parties, pushed through trade agreements, those jobs went overseas. 600 workers around Kettering, Ohio had nowhere to turn when Tenneco closed. 200 steel workers in Canton and Massillon were left without livelihoods when Republic Steel closed plants last year. When Cleveland Cliffs idled their 10 mill in Weirton, West Virginia, workers from West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania worked there. It was a direct result of weak trade enforcement. Hundreds of Ohioans lost their jobs. That community has been devastated, but the federal government had nothing to offer. In nearly every state, workers feel the negative impacts of trade, while the geniuses in Washington extol the virtues of free trade. Thousands of workers across the country wait for trade adjustment assistance. In the chairman's state of Oregon, 5,700 workers waiting. In Idaho, the ranking member, 800 workers waiting. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit to the record the number of TAA petitions pending in each state, including yours and Senator Crapo's, represented by members of this committee.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and I'll close with this. We can't let this go on any longer. Workers are suffering. We must renew TAA. I've got a bill, the TAA Reauthorization Act, that would renew TAA through 2030. I encourage everyone in this committee to support. I should note that Chair Wyden supports it, of course, because he stands for workers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that my colleagues are also interested in reauthorizing GSP and other programs, but if Congress is going to pass any trade agreement, any trade package, any trade bill, it must include TAA. Reauthorizing It is the bare minimum when it comes to trade policy. I've heard this song and dance for my entire career. We'll take care of the loser workers a little bit through a few dollars to them. That's not the right trade policy. If we're serious about competing with China, more importantly, if we're serious about supporting American workers, we need to get serious about our trade enforcement. I am thrilled that this country finally in the last few years has an industrial policy, but it simply won't work without trade enforcement. It means passing TAA. It also means passing the level the playing field 2.0 to strengthen trade enforcement, help prevent workers from losing their jobs in the first place. Chairman, thanks for your time.
I thank my colleague, and I want our guests to understand the concept behind the important work Senator Brown is doing. He is talking about workers who have been laid off through no fault of their own. That's who we're talking about here. And he is coming up with ideas to get those folks back in the winner's circle. And he is pointing out that a lot of the programs, as he calls it, is essentially losing insurance. You know, you've lost, things are bad, everybody's hanging crepe. And Senator Brown is saying, no, that's not the way we're going to go. We're going to talk about programs that get workers back in the winner's circle, and I'm proud to work with them. Okay. I believe Senator Warren is next, but then Senator Blackburn would be next if nobody comes in. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Brown, for your leadership on these trade issues. It's so important to working people all across our country, and I completely support what you're doing here. You know, for too long, our trade policy has been a global race to the bottom. Corporate lobbyists and trade negotiators worked in back rooms to ink deals that lowered labor and environmental standards and made it easier to offshore jobs. American workers have had enough. And finally, some politicians in Washington are starting to listen to those workers, but not everyone. House Republicans just advanced a bill to extend the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, a program that lowered U.S. tariffs on goods imported from certain countries without requiring those countries to cut tariffs on our exports as well. And those same Republicans oppose renewing the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, or TAA, that Senator Brown was talking about, which helps American workers get back on their feet when they lose their jobs due to trade. So I also would like to talk about TAA and other policy tools that we have to protect U.S. competitiveness and workers. So let's just start with a little Econ 101. Ms. Gill, you're the legal director of Global Labor Justice. So tell me, when the U.S. cuts tariffs and imports more goods from abroad, is it just a win-win for Americans?
Thank you, Senator. No, I think it's really clear that even with very careful tailoring of programs, gains from trade are not always equally distributed, and some workers do lose out.
Okay, so we have workers losing out when that happens. And this is basic economics that even free traders have to admit to. Some people lose from trade. So what are we going to do about that? Number one, we need to protect our workers from unfair trade. And that's why President Biden is raising tariffs on massively subsidized Chinese imports, like cars and computer chips and steel and aluminum that undercut American workers. Number two, we need to invest in American competitiveness, like we have with our domestic semiconductor industry and clean energy manufacturing. But even with all that, some workers will lose their jobs due to trade, and that is where TAA comes in, helping those workers find new jobs. Ms. Gill, what does TAA mean for the workers who receive it?
As I noted in my remarks, we believe that labor justice begins here at home. We stand with the U.S. labor movement to call for TAA together with a renewal of GSP. TAA provides resources for retraining workers who have lost their jobs due to trade. It provides sort of extended unemployment insurance. And some analysis of the program shows that about 10 years out, workers who've received a helping hand from TAA have earned $50,000 more than workers who haven't received the assistance.
Okay, so people get training, and as a result of the training, they're actually able to get good paying jobs. And they're earning, I think you said, about $50,000 more a year 10 years out because they got some assistance after they lost their jobs. You know, since TAA lapsed in mid-2022, over 100,000 workers have lost their jobs due to trade, but have been unable to get these TAA benefits. Meanwhile, House Republicans advanced legislation renewing GSP, which would retroactively cut U.S. tariffs, already among the lowest in the world. Under this Republican bill, large businesses and importers who decided it was worth paying a tariff to import goods from overseas as far back as 3 years ago would get a windfall refund of $2.6 billion. By the way, that is 5 times the cost of TAA. Ms. Gill, I know there's a lot of work that we can do to update GSP to raise labor and environmental standards in the countries that benefit from it. But wouldn't you agree that if we're going to renew a tariff cut program like GSP, we should also renew TAA?
Simply put, yes.
Yes, I like that answer. Exactly right. You know, thank you. I appreciate this. American workers are sick and tired of the race to the bottom in trade and the slashing of investments in our domestic economy. And I'm glad that under President Biden's leadership, we're turning things around. Since he came into office, the United States has added 80,000 new manufacturing jobs. But there is still so much more to do. Over 100,000 American workers across the country are waiting for Congress to renew TAA and to help them get back on their feet. We owe it to them. Let's get this done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I was thinking about a modest filibuster in hopes that some of our other colleagues, but we've got very committed to trade policy. For example, Senator Carper, chairman of a key committee dealing with environmental issues, has been a champion on these issues and just is in the middle of it. So unless any other senators are coming, I just close that I think in the discussion I had with Ms. Gill, it's been reaffirmed by, all of you today that we're talking about a pretty straightforward, proposition. The trading partners get tariff breaks on goods they ship to the United States. That's a winner for them. And we, in turn, get them to commit to the high standards that uplift everybody. A winning idea. And by the way, these are not mutually exclusive. You can make both of them work hand in hand, which is what I think all of you have said. So that balance that I've described is a win for workers, it's a win for businesses, and I believe that's the case at home and abroad. So I'm going to be urging colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the House to look for a bipartisan, bicameral path forward with respect to renewal, that we do it in an expeditious way. I want to thank all of our witnesses, and lo and behold, another senator has arrived. Is he here? 1 minute. Momentarily, so I have to carry on for another full minute. What else might we do? Well, we might explain the committee process. Members are going to have to get their questions for the record by June 12th, and we'll also keep the record open for all of you. And I'll try to hold my breath for a moment, and we'll see if we can help our member on his way. All right. Is there anything else the four of you would like to add in this brief time-killing exercise? Yes, Ms. Lizzer.
I didn't get a chance to say, but I think it's really important, and you wrote a letter about this recently when President Ruto was here, that we go beyond AGOA. We need to be looking at tools that advance our economic relationship with Africans, and we very much advocate free trade agreements. We advocate for agreements like the U.S.-Kenya Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership. We'd like to see market access added to that via a free trade agreement, and we think that a series of those around the continent could create the kind of framework that's needed to expand U.S.-Africa trade, investment, and business. Thank you.
Ambassador Whitman has been talking about those kinds of issues as well, so there's lots of interest. And look, I mean, the suite of programs, GSP, AGOA, HOPE, HELP, these other crucial programs are obviously going to have to be a more critical component of our trade policy, and I think that's what your point makes. One last question that I think might be appropriate at this point is AGOA is usually extended for 10 years. Why is that kind of long-term reauthorization so crucial in your work? Would you like to start with that, Ms. Lizer?
I'd be happy to say that the having it be a long-term renewal gives the kind of certainty not only for people who are trading, but for investors. And as Ms. Nelson noted, these investments are made well in advance and take years to realize the returns on them. So shorter renewals of AGOA don't really incentivize investments into African production, manufacturing, and the resiliency in supply chains that is now happening, moving companies out of China into Africa. So we very much support a long-term extension, at least 10 years. Thank you.
And if I could, sorry, can I add one more thing?
Please.
Oh, sorry. Apologies for interrupting. Most of our senior members of our sourcing team are right now in Africa, and they are meeting with people who are talking about investments. They are planning them, they are preparing for it, but they are waiting to give it the green light until AGOA is renewed.
Tell us a little bit about those people that are on such trips. What are they, entrepreneurs? Are they
No, I'm talking about our sourcing team. So we are, we go where we source. So all of our senior leaders, our chief product officer, our VP of sourcing, and many people that are there looking and figuring out what is working on the ground, how to work with the people there. We pride ourselves on being responsible sourcing partners and really understanding and working with to project out how many products will we need? What's the best for their workers? How do we give them enough time so that everyone can do production planning and make the most efficient use of their time so you're not having overtime at the last minute? We do incredible training, not just internally, but with all of our factory partners, and we require them to do trainings for their workers to make sure that we are exporting these American values that everybody has discussed today, workers' rights, human rights, and in order to make sure that that's happening, you need to actually go to the countries. And so we're there all the time.
Senator, if I may? Yeah. The other thing that I think is really critically important that hasn't been mentioned so far is that supplier relationships are an iterative process. You don't just suddenly call up a company and have them manufacturing your product for you. In my previous life as a trade lawyer, we dealt with this a lot with tariff exclusions and some of the tariffs that were first in place during the Trump administration. Just simply qualifying a new manufacturer to produce a product that you've already been producing takes time. And so if you have very short-term extensions, particularly for more complex manufacturers or manufacturing inputs that are used by American manufacturers here, you just simply can't flip a switch and have those things flow and then stop flowing for a year or two at a time. That's why long-term predictability and consistency in the trade policy space is so critically important for not only AGOA and GSP, but more broadly for U.S. trade and tariff policy.
Two important Senate chairmen have just arrived magically. So I want to let them ask their questions. Senator Carper.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for holding this hearing today. As you know, there's a lot going on, and I'm delighted that got here in time to ask a question or two. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you all. Thank you for joining us. Voluntary trade preference programs have been a tool that our country has used to help lift up developing countries by offering them, as you know, access to American markets. The Generalized System of Preference Programs, GSP, has allowed countries to access U.S. markets, to create new jobs, and to diversify their economies. I was proud to work with Senator Rob Portman, former senator from Ohio, to add a more robust environmental criteria to the generalized system of preference programs. In the Senate, when we passed the reauthorization as part of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, I think it was in 2021. The bipartisan product would have taken a long overdue and important step forward in incentivizing developing countries around the world to improve their environmental standards. A question, if I could, for Ms. Nelson and for Ms. Gill, please. Here's my question, same question for both of you. Could you please discuss for us how trade preference programs can encourage developing programs to improve their environmental standards and work to address the threat of climate change while promoting job creation? Please. Ms. Nelson.
Thank you so much for the question.
Right.
On my team at SanMar, we have entire separate groups for sustainability, traceability, social responsibility, product safety, and we have made commitments to science-based targets that have been approved. This is a really important issue for us right now, and it's something that we work with all of the factories in all 20 countries where we are right now, but it is one more way in which we are able to move the dial and have an impact in the communities where we are sourcing from. And there's a lot of training involved. So not just reducing our carbon footprint, going not just to our tier 1 factories, but down to tier 2, tier 3, really understanding the entire supply chain. And that's a critical importance to us. And it's already having a big impact.
Okay, good. Thanks, Ms. Nelson. Ms. Gill, the same question.
Thanks. I think that's a really important question, and we know that climate justice and labor justice are deeply interlinked. That climate change is impacting workers, and so, and that is on both sides of the trade relationship. So we know that climate change is impacting workers abroad, in the countries that benefit from GSP, and stronger environmental standards would help protect those workers. And it also affects workers here who have to compete sometimes with countries that may not uphold the same environmental standards that are upheld by American workers and American laws. So strengthening the environmental standards in programs like GSP would actually help protect workers on both sides of the trade relationship.
Say your last sentence. I couldn't hear it. Just repeat your last sentence. You faded out.
That strengthening environmental standards in programs like GSP would help protect workers on both sides of the trade relationship, protect workers in supply chain countries and beneficiary countries through stronger standards, but also protect American workers from not having to compete with lower standards elsewhere.
Good. That was worth repeating. Thanks very much. One more question, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Africa is the home of the fastest growing population on our planet, and it's expected to account for 1/4 of the world's population by 2050, 1/4. That said, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, has seen tremendous success since it was created. 2023, I had the privilege to travel with a number of our colleagues in a bipartisan CODEL, where I learned about the impact of the AGOA program and how it has supported new economic growth through trade and investment and created new jobs for hundreds, maybe thousands of Kenyans. Question for Ms. Is it Lazier? Okay, Ms. Lazier. As Congress looks to reauthorize AGOA, what updates to the program would you recommend the Congress consider to better support the economies of developing countries?
Thank you, Senator. First of all, a long-term extension as soon as possible, minimum of 10 years. There are some enhancements that we have recommended, just very briefly. Reviews that are annual now. We recommend that they be done every 3 years. That would give more certainty to buyers and investors and to the African producers. We're looking at adding cumulation so that North African countries like Morocco, that has an FTA with us, can also count in AGOA exports from the AGOA eligible countries. We're recommending that the apparel and textile visa, which is required of the more than 100 countries that export apparel to the U.S. The Africans and Haiti are the only ones who still have to have an actual apparel visa. So we recommend that this be harmonized, that they be treated in the same way that other apparel exporters are doing that. And last, we think that we should be very careful and not graduate countries like Mauritius, who are doing all the things that we want them to do to expand their economies and then become middle-income countries. They should not be punished and then put out of AGOA, which is a program that helped them to get there in the first place. So those are some of the enhancements we would recommend. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much.
I thank my colleague and another member of this committee who has a great interest in environmental policy, Senator Whitehouse. Between he and Senator Carper, we can just give them the whole portfolio. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks very much, Chairman Wyden. Let me just start by adding my voice to the chorus of those saying that we do not intend to extend preferences without trade adjustment assistance being a part of the equation. It is, I think, essential and it's fair. I think we're only now beginning to catch up through trade policy to the problem that as corporations and industries have become multinational and international, they've been able to play a game of competitive race to the bottom, in many cases with the participant country being paid well for indulging that race to the bottom. We see that particularly in the dark economy where crooks and kleptocrats can hide money in various countries, and the countries make a great deal of money for doing that, even though they're supporting terrorism, the drug trade, international crime, et cetera. So I think we have some catching up to do. I applaud Secretary Yellen for her ardent pursuit of a minimum corporate tax so that the race to the bottom on corporate taxation does not continue to empower big international corporations to bully and compete unfairly with small businesses that can't open a facility in some low-tax entity, pretend that all their work is being done there, and avoid fair taxation. Can't wait till we can end the ISDS completely, which lets huge international industries bully little countries through threats of litigation or actual litigation. We're working now, and I know that the chairman is very keenly aware of all of this, on carbon border tariffs so that cheating on emissions is not a way to seek competitive advantage. And I applaud the European Union for their carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'm urging them to be as forceful and unrelenting with it as possible because it really matters that we get this right. I'm delighted. I'm not a total fan of the Conservative government in the UK, but I'm delighted that they have chosen to participate in the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I hope that after the election, should there be a Labour government, they will continue with equal enthusiasm. I guess, Ms. Gill, you just touched on this, so let me go back to you just to clarify the point. One of my frustrations has been that we put environmental provisions into trade agreements and they instantly become decorative. Nobody actually bothers to go around and enforce them seriously at all. And it seems to me that if we're going to pursue GSP further, there ought to be some minimum environmental standards, at least complying with your own country's laws, and that there should be a much stronger understanding about those parts of the agreement actually being enforced by the United States and others, that it's not just decorative to make the environmental groups go away and then we forget about it, that it actually is an important part of real competitiveness. And if you could comment on that in my 1 minute and 10 seconds remaining, that would be lovely.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. I think you're right. None of this works without enforcement, and that means enforcement of labor provisions. It means enforcement of environmental provisions, because without strong enforcement and without strong provisions, it is an unfair advantage that benefits not workers in beneficiary countries, not workers in the U.S., but to importers and corporations. So we need strong standards, and they need to be enforced robustly.
You did it. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to
Senator
all the
Wyden.
witnesses. Really appreciate the focus on this. I think we're finally catching up to the fact that corporations have really sought unfair economic advantage in the space by creating a international competition for worst standards that they can then take advantage of. And we're now starting to fight back against that, and I think it'll be much to everybody's advantage and benefit if we get that right and don't allow this corporate race to the bottom supported by countries that are often mistakenly allowing those kind of unfair and improper competitive advantage. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse, earlier we had a discussion with Senator Cardin about the whole standard setting idea. And I think it is very appropriate that you end today, and it's been an excellent hearing. And I'm not sure if you had a mic problem or something, but you said something, and I turned to the staff. You said that environmental policy is not supposed to be decorative. It's not just supposed to be some add-on kind of thing that doesn't matter. I think that sums it up. And I will send all of you off with an additional kind of chore as we work in a bipartisan way to strengthen the standards that we have, whether they be digital or environmental or a variety of different areas. I think we heed Senator Whitehouse's point. This is not something that's supposed to get short shrift. The consequence of environmental issues are economic consequences, they're human rights consequences. It's a great one to quit on. As we said in basketball, I thank our guests. And with that, the Finance Committee is adjourned.